On the show more description of the YouTube video, you'll see that there is a URL that you can open and will take you to a folder that has a bunch of resources from all of our sessions. Look specifically for the resources labeled 4-21. There should be 3 of them: a handout, 421 prompt for lesson, and 421 AP practice. If you want to pull those up, we'll be working with them today, and then we'll get started in about 30 seconds. All right, happy Tuesday. Welcome back. For those of you who've been tuning in, you might notice I'm by myself. I do not have an amazing celebrity or actor by my side today. I'm flying solo. But if you did not watch yesterday, I'm going to really encourage you to go and check out the session for April 20th. April 20th was a wonderful session that we had. Actor Tony Hale was on, and he had such fantastic insight into real life reading and writing. And I particularly loved his insights on how do you respond to criticism and how do you handle stress. I think a lot of my students focus a lot on that, and how do I perform under pressure, how do I write an essay in 45 minutes? And then how do I take feedback from my teacher and not take it personally, but then grow from it? So I thought he had some great insights. So I'd strongly encourage you to check that out. And then at the very end of the lesson, Mrs. Knight was talking about how she created a workshop almost to help guide you guys through how to introduce and embed evidence. Specifically, she asked students to look at a particular quotation from a passage and then consider the various ways that you can embed it into your own writing to make it a little bit more fluid and less clunky. If you did not watch yesterday's session, do. It's great. But you could also access these resources, and if not, you can still kind of pay attention. Hopefully it will help you moving forward how to embed your own evidence. So the primary goal of her workshop yesterday was to get you to think about how you can take someone else's writing, like a quote from a person, and weave and embed it into your own language so it's fluid and it makes sense. And some of the tips she gave you were to paraphrase the quote, to put it at the beginning of your own writing, to sandwich it in the middle where your writing is at the beginning and at the end, to segment or to place a segment at the end of a sentence, or she even gave you tips on how to put multiple quotations in one particular sentence of your own writing. So if you completed the activity, it might not look the exact same as ours, but I think that this will give you some good insight into how you could construct your own writing and embed your evidence in a more fluid manner. All of these are good. Maybe you pause the recording and take a moment to look through which of these speak more to your writing style. All of these are good. The main thing to avoid is just having a sentence stuck by itself where it opens and closes with the quotation. All right, so for today, we're going to talk about a topic that is something that a lot of students hold near and dear to their heart, and that is commentary and talking about analysis. And I want to give you a quick anecdote. I've been teaching AP Lang now for I think 15, maybe 16 years. So I've taught thousands of students. One of my favorite students of all time graduated maybe 5 years ago. And when he was a senior, I sent him an email, or I found him in the hallway, and I said, hey, would you mind giving me a few of your essays? Because I thought they were really good. I would love to be able to use them in my current class. I'll take your name off of them. And he was a wonderful young man. He was like, sure, go right ahead. So he gives me 2 or 3 essays. I'm going through them, trying to pull out like a paragraph or a topic sentence that my students could work with. And on the back, I saw that he had been passing notes with someone else in the class. And on the back of his essay, he wrote something like, she always says more analysis needed. I have no idea what she's talking about. And there's this like amazing exchange between Glenn and this other student about, we don't know what she means. And I think that that was a really good moment for me as a teacher to recognize that sometimes we say things like analysis and commentary, and we think it's clear, but it might not be to you. So my goal today is to really help you understand how commentary is going to be evaluated on your rubric and what it means. I think that sometimes analysis seems so nebulous and broad and overwhelming that I want to make it as concrete as possible to you today. So describing what it means, but then also exploring how are you able to embed more commentary in your writing? If you had to essentially create tasks or steps, what would those be? And then we're going to be looking at it in some student writing too, just so you can examine how it might all fit together. First, let's look at the rubric itself. I know some of you get really hung up on thesis. My students do as well. And I like that. Great. A thesis is very important. But what I always encourage my students to do is to spend more time in their body paragraphs, get into the meat of the essay because you get 4 points for evidence and commentary. It's so much more of a big ticket item than a thesis statement. So I always say get your thesis and then really start developing your body paragraphs. That's what's crucial is if you take more time to develop your body paragraphs, you're probably going to end up with a higher score because that's where 4 points come from, 4 out of the 6. It can influence your sophistication point as well, depending on how you weave your commentary in. And we'll be talking more about sophistication, I think in like a week or so. But I wanted to take a moment here to call attention to how the rubric describes commentary, and that it's basically a connection between your evidence and your claim or the line of reasoning. We're going to start by looking at the difference between a 2 and a 3 because that's a real hinge from passing the exam that you want to make sure if you are typically in that 2 range, what do I need to do to move into the 3? Specifically with the rubric, it describes a 2 in terms of commentary as having simplistic, inaccurate, or repetitive explanations that don't strengthen the argument. Typically with my students, when I give them that feedback, it's more of just they have a very simplistic, it's rare that they're having an inaccurate, but it's more of it's just very obvious. It's not very insightful. It's not strengthening the argument. So it's a little simplistic, or it might just be repeating what has already been said. Another bullet point that you'll see here under decision rules and scoring notes is that for a 2, in terms of commentary, it does not explain the connections of progression between the student's claims, so a line of reasoning is not clearly established, basically that you aren't connecting your evidence. As opposed to a 3, the student will, quote, focus on the importance of specific words and details from the passage to build an argument. The examples and the analysis of them will be more specific. It's not going to be very vague and broad. It'll be tied to specific details or words. I also love this bullet point that commentary may fail to integrate some evidence or fail to support a key claim, meaning they aren't analyzing all aspects of the example or not supporting the claim. The evidence does not fully support the claim. And I highlight that because a 3 still has room to grow too, but you'll notice that it is much more specific and it has more commentary to it. So in your resources, again, in the show more portion of the description of this YouTube video, you'll have access to a folder. And in that folder, you'll see something labeled 4-21 prompt for lesson. I want us to spend just a little bit of time looking at samples from the 2019, I believe the 2019 free response question. It's a letter that Gandhi wrote to Lord Irwin, trying to remove taxation on salt in India and ultimately grant India independence. Pause the feed and take about 10 minutes. That's what we've been recommending for you to take 10 minutes to break down the prompt and the passage. You'll take 3 minutes just to try to understand the prompt itself. What is it really asking you? What information is it giving you? How might you recognize the rhetorical situation within it? And then take 7 minutes to do a quick read of the passage itself, his letter, thinking about some of the main ideas and some of the choices he makes to prove his point. So pause the feed, become familiar with the passage. You don't have to know it deeply, but just so when we're looking at the samples, you're able to contextualize it a little. So pause the feed and then come back and we'll look at some samples. All right, so here are two paragraphs from two separate students, sample A and sample B, and you'll also have these in the 4-21 handout in case you want to make a copy of that or download it, or you can just look at the screen and try to think how you might complete this task. But what I'd like for you to do is pause the feed and read through each description, first highlighting, or if it's easier to underline, whenever the student's providing evidence. That will be something explicit from the text. It might not be a direct quotation, though. Thinking about the lesson that Mrs. Knight delivered yesterday, it could be paraphrasing. It could be leading into it and providing some summary information. So whenever you see the student referencing something from the text, even if it's just through a paraphrased language, I want you to underline it or highlight it in one color. Then I want you to highlight the commentary in a separate color, or maybe you double underline it if that's easier for you. And I know we've not talked about what commentary is yet, but think about it just in terms of that word, where the student is commenting on the example. So anytime the student is explaining or analyzing the example, highlight it in a separate color. This should take you about 5 minutes, so pause the feed, take a few moments to read through both paragraphs, highlighting the evidence in one color, the commentary in another, and maybe also think about which of these got the 2 and which got the 3, and how do you know that based on the information in the rubric? All right, are you ready to see how I highlighted it? I highlighted the evidence in yellow and then the analysis in green. Sample A is the paragraph that received the 3. Sample B received the 2. And I think that that's a really interesting point, even if I'm a real visual learner. And when you just look at it, you can see sample A only has one example, sample B has 2. So you would automatically assume, oh, well, sample B must be better because there's more support. However, if you look at sample A, there's more green than yellow. So we know the commentary, the discussion is going to be richer with sample A than it is with sample B. And that's one of the main reasons why sample A moves into a 3. There's more discussion. Whereas sample B, the commentary is there, as we can see because it's highlighted in green. It's there and it's good, but the connection between the evidence and the ideas, it's not entirely clear. The student says, this shows that the author is carefully choosing his words. Well, like, which words were carefully chosen? Why were they carefully chosen? How does this show a duty and not a threat? That the student doesn't fully examine the example itself. And the other way, again, visually, you spend about half of the paragraph is in yellow, the other half is in green. So they're equally weighted. If you were to highlight your own writing, you'd want to make sure that you have more green than yellow. The more analysis, the better. So let's talk a little bit about what justifies or defines or describes commentary in student writing. Think about it as though it's any time that you, again, are commenting on a piece of an example, something you've pulled from the text. And another way that I like to describe it to my own students is to think about it as though it's an iceberg. And what you can see on top is the obvious. It's something that everyone can see and everyone can describe. That's your evidence. You can point to it in a passage. The commentary is what lies beneath the surface, and 90% of an iceberg is underwater. So there's a lot to pull out from that example. So the commentary is what's underwater. The commentary is how you see the example in a way that's different from everyone else, or that isn't just verbatim straight from the passage, but going beneath the surface and thinking about what isn't obvious to everyone. With AP Language, we have a curriculum that us teachers follow, excuse me, and in that we have a series of standards, and we also have, as you saw from the rubric, descriptors that I think really help capture how you might define commentary. Here are 3 ways that I pulled out. Commentary explains the significance and relevance of evidence in relation to the line of reasoning. It explains how rhetorical choices in the passage contributes to the writer's argument, purpose, or message. And then commentary explains how evidence supports a line of reasoning. If we had to summarize each of those into like categories or tips or ways in which you could achieve that, I would maybe describe them this way. The first one is really looking at the importance of the example itself. Explain the significance and the relevance of the evidence. Why is it important? The second is really talking about the rhetorical situation, how those rhetorical choices contribute to argument, purpose, and message. You've heard Mrs. Knight and I talk nonstop about the rhetorical situation. Those are 3 of the 6 elements in the rhetorical situation. So I think another way you could think about commentary is how an example relates or conveys information about the rhetorical situation. And then the last one is a really important piece, and that's how you connect it to your claim. How does it fit into the line of reasoning? I wish I could give you an acronym or you must do all of these things, but so much of it really depends on you as a reader. It depends on the passage. It depends on the examples you pull out. It even depends on how you're feeling the day of a timed writing or the day of the AP exam. If you're feeling rushed for time, you might not do all of these. You might only do one. I'm going to walk you through each of them, though, just to give you more in your toolkit and that you can decide which of these best relates to your claim, your example, or again, like just how you're feeling on that day. Oh, sorry, one more thing. And the only like clear-cut tip I could give you is to strive for at least 2 sentences of commentary for each example. So if you have 2 examples, then you should have around 4 sentences of commentary in your whole paragraph. Strive for at least 2. I think the more you have, a 3 or a 4 sentence, the better. All right, so let's look at the first thing, examining the importance. Giving you a series of questions that you might want to consider asking, and if you need to pause the feed to jot some of these down, go right ahead. It's not an exhaustive list. These are just some suggestions of things that you could ask yourself depending on your example. And these questions are really hovering all around your choice. What choice have you picked out to examine? So looking at things like, what is this example stating? How was the choice seen in the example? What effect is produced by this example or choice? Why would the writer make this choice? And how might the whole piece be different or less effective if the choice weren't made? Why is it an effective choice? Why is it so important to the piece? And even how does this example or choice build upon previous examples? And I think this last bullet point, I think we'll be talking about that maybe on 427 and looking at the relationship between examples. Really strong students can look at their second example and relate it to their first and talk about how there's a relationship between the 2 examples. The biggest thing that I would encourage you to do is to make sure that all of this is tied to your line of reasoning. It's all tied to your claim and that you aren't just randomly examining alliteration, but it's alliteration within the scope or the lens of the claim that you're trying to prove within a body paragraph, your argument itself. I do want to highlight one thing that's really particular with my students, and that's the second bullet point. A lot of my students struggle with explaining how the choice is seen in the example. They tend to just state, here's a choice, here's an example, and then they jump straight into an idea. And something I've used with them, I don't know if you were younger and you ever heard an English teacher or language arts teacher reference show, don't tell. I tell my students something similar. I say, explore, don't just state. So make sure you're explaining the relationship between things. Don't assume, don't just tell me that this sentence uses passionate diction. Tell me what diction, which words are passionate in that example. So here's an example of something that I would possibly see from my students. They would write something like, the writer incorporates imagery such as, quote, dry and parched surface, even the bushes smelt unpleasantly. This shows the writer is appealing to pathos because the islands are not a place someone would want to visit. The student just tells me it appeals to pathos. They don't explain to me how it appeals to pathos. I want to know, what is the image? Why would this image appeal to pathos? In what way? That if the student had one more sentence between the example and the this shows, it would make it a lot clearer. I will also say, this is a pet peeve of mine, that phrase, this shows, because if you're going to say that it shows, it needs to be clear. And in this case, it's not clear to me that the writer is appealing to pathos. So make sure you're really explaining how the choice is seen in the example. Tell your reader how you want them to see that example itself before you jump into your ideas. Another category, another way that you could be incorporating analysis into your writing is to relate your example to the rhetorical situation. Remember, the task is not asking you to analyze the choices the writer makes, but is asking you to analyze the rhetorical choices the writer makes. So you always want to steep your example in the rhetorical situation found through the prompt or your study of the passage itself. So you might ask yourself, you might give an example in your writing and then ask yourself, how is it persuasive to the audience? What does it reveal about the speaker? This third bullet point is really speaking to exigence. What does it suggest about why the writer has composed the piece? In what way does this example reflect the time period in which it was written or delivered as speaking to context? How does this help the writer achieve his or her purpose? And then the last one is speaking to message and argument. For me, I think the most important is that first bullet point. How was this persuasive to the audience? Especially if it's a speech or a letter, something where an audience has clearly been defined in the prompt itself. Think about why the writer would make that choice for that particular audience. That usually is a surefire way to get you to provide commentary that reflects the rhetorical situation. All right, and then the last area is to connect it back to your claim. And this is a clear priority on the rubric. The rubric gives one particular bullet point just to the connection made between the evidence and the claim. It is the binding. It really pulls your whole paragraph together. It adds cohesion to the paragraph. It makes everything seem to fit better. I think the key is to start by looking at, and maybe you get toward the end of your body paragraph and you pause and say, what did I set out to prove in this paragraph? Remind yourself of that, and then add a sentence or two that connects your example to that particular claim. I would encourage you to not use the same language, though. Try to vary it up, primarily because if you are using the same words over and over again, if it didn't make sense to me the first time, it's not going to make sense to me the second or third. So try to change up the language a little bit and make sure it's explicit. So you might specifically answer, in what way does this example relate to what I'm arguing in my topic sentence? How does it connect to my claim? What's the main idea of this example? How does this relate to the main idea of the paragraph? And then looking at the subject matter of the claim too. Maybe you kind of like, again, stop and ask yourself these questions and force yourself to write the answer at the end of a body paragraph. If you can't do it for each example, then make sure it's built into the last two sentences or so of each body paragraph. I know that this year's a little bit different because you won't be, not all of you are going to be handwriting your essay. You now have the option to type it. But in a normal year, what I would say to my students, and this is a good tip for those of you who are handwriting, to write in the margin of your essay the 2 or 3 key words you're trying to prove in the paragraph, so that every time you write a sentence and you get back to the next line, you can see those key words. It's like a subtle reminder to you to make sure that you are staying focused on proving that particular claim. This year, if you are handwriting, maybe you just like write on your note paper in big bold letters 2 or 3 words that capture what you're trying to prove in the paragraph. And that might be your subtle reminder or your subtle hint for this year. Think of this as though it's the bridge. You've got to make a bridge between your evidence and your claim. Why would the writer make that choice? How does that prove a particular claim or argument? All right, so let's practice by going back to those 2 samples I asked for you to highlight earlier. And let's start with sample B, our 2. If we were to go back in and read the analysis a little bit more carefully, you might notice that the student is examining the importance and connecting the claim. The first example, the student writes, "This shows that the author is carefully choosing his words as it helps his letter flow and get across the certain point he would like Erwin to understand. The student, it's again the show don't tell. The student says that it shows he carefully chooses his words, but it doesn't explain how or which words. It's a little vague, and the student also says it helps let her flow, but that's not necessarily what the claim is making in this body paragraph. It's about um, proposing not a threat, but a duty he must fulfill. So the flow of his letter doesn't really relate much either. The student does reference Lord Irwin, but not necessarily why it's persuasive to him. So the student's really only exploring one element, the importance, and even that's a little too vague for me. I would like more details about the importance of him choosing his words in order to justify that as a 3. Then in this second example, the student writes that he uses these words to express why and how the things he mentions in the letter will be done. Instead of a threat, he uses these words to signify a promise. So here, the student does a nice job of connecting back to the point of that body paragraph, the threat, not the duty. The student kind of just restates it though. Student's not putting it into his or her own words, and they've not really proven it through the example, but at least I do see a connection to the claim, so that's pretty good. All right, let's look at the 3 now. So only one example, but you can see the student took all 3 of those tips and wove it into the analysis of that one example. So first, the student says Gandhi believes that he has a godly duty to the people of India to gain independence. And he's referencing the highlights or the significance of that particular example by referencing the godly duty. So we see the importance there. I also think the student does a really nice job of building up to that example. And while it might not necessarily be commentary, it's helping us to better understand the importance of the example itself. The student connects back to the claim next by writing, there is no stronger resolve than to work with your religion. And if you go back to the first sentence of this paragraph, in the letter, the overall tone is resolve. So now I wish the student used a different word there, but again, at least it's connecting to the claim. So everything is like tied up nicely. And then I love this last sentence. I think that this last sentence does a great job of still somewhat connecting to the claim, but really exploring the rhetorical situation. The student writes, we know that Gandhi and the people of India have a strong resolve to stick to civil disobedience and nonviolent actions committed to help gain independence from Britain. You see reference to the speaker, Gandhi, the people of India, the context, and the exigence of them wanting to stick to civil disobedience and nonviolent actions, which speaks to why he's so compelled to write. I think that this is tough to do, but the student did a great job of getting 3 separate categories covered in the analysis. You might not do that. It might just be 1 or 2 of these. But I think that regardless, really try to push for more than 2 sentences. As you can see here, this student has, I think, 4 total. So the more sentences you have that are either examining the importance, connecting to your claim, or relating to the rhetorical situation, the better. All right, so just a quick review. Commentary and analysis. I know that it is vague. I know that it's nebulous and abstract to you and to my student Glenn, who's out there somewhere. Instead, try to think about it as though there are 3 things I can do with my examples. And hopefully I can do all of them depending on the example, the passage, myself, my reading, etc. But maybe I have a sentence or 2 examining the importance of the choice itself. Maybe I add a sentence or 2 of how does this relate to elements of the rhetorical situation, with the key being, depending on the genre, why it's persuasive to this particular audience. And then lastly, make sure you're connecting to your claim that you're trying to set out and prove in a body paragraph. So for tonight, a practice I would love to give you is a student paragraph, and I've removed the commentary. So you'll see here, I've already highlighted for you what the evidence is, but I've removed the commentary. I'm going to ask for you to go in and add commentary to this sample, adding at least 2 sentences per example, and it can be in any of those elements, the examining the importance, the relating to the rhetorical situation, or connecting to the claim. And think about if there's a particular area that you want to practice, and then we'll look at those tomorrow. So I hope you have a great day. My push for you today is to connect with someone outside of your house. So reach out to a friend or a teacher and have some sort of a connection that's more meaningful than just, hey, how's it going? I think that's good for all of us, and it's really nice and cathartic for our souls. So take some time to connect with someone out there outside your home, and we will see you guys tomorrow. Have a great day.